It was nearly 8 o'clock by the time I got to my office, having dropped off Lance at his place in Greenwich Village and the McIntyres at theirs in Gramercy Park. I had no desire to drive to my place, so I stopped for takeout, figuring to eat at my desk and spend the night on the couch. I planned to drive home in the morning for a shower and a shave. The flight back from Indianapolis had been quiet, with me fighting air sickness the whole way while a dark gloom hung over Lance and the McIntyres. My job was done, or at least part of it was. I'd found and reunited Melissa with her father. As for Ben Jr., well, I was pretty certain he was the murder victim I'd read about in the Indianapolis Star, even if the professor and Melissa preferred to blind themselves to that probability. Although Melissa had paid me for 5 days' work, I preferred returning the unused portion of my fee to nosing around further and having to be the bearer of bad news. In my mind, the Indianapolis morgue had in its possession an unidentified body of which they would in time dispose. Melissa and her father would wrestle with what had become of Ben Jr., and so I was not yet convinced that I would pass along my theory of his demise to the elder McIntyre, providing him closure and leaving him to bear the bad news to Melissa. But I'd have to make up my mind soon, within 24 hours, before the evidence was gone, if it wasn't already. As for Professor McIntyre's wild yarn about time travel and alternate realities, I was glad to be done with this case. I'd left with him the German's weapon and the supposed time travel device. Melissa had secured in her desk at Columbia a device that purportedly held the secret location of Adolf Hitler's body, lying frozen in some alternate reality awaiting a cure for the cancer that ailed him. According to the professor, in the year 2047, that remedy had been discovered. I sighed aloud. I was tired, and tired too, of trying to convince myself of the illegitimacy of McIntyre's story. I'd seen no real proof, merely a tiny device that may or may not have been what McIntyre claimed it to be, a strange-looking weapon I'd not seen discharged, and 2 German thugs hot after the professor for reasons that I couldn't disprove. His story was too far-fetched to be true, yet it could also be argued that it was too far-fetched not to be true. If it all was just a ruse, then why not concoct a story that was a hell of a lot easier, a hell of a lot more believable? I'd asked myself that question too many times already, and no answer was forthcoming. I only knew I'd be a fool to discount the whole of McIntyre's claim, even if I no longer cared to satisfy my curiosity. Tomorrow McIntyre would call his friend Nigel in London for further instructions on what to do with the strange cube I'd only heard about. I couldn't deny I was curious about what might be discussed on that call. God knew I loved a good mystery, and this one I'd only just begun to unravel. Still, my instincts warned me that further involvement, whether in locating Ben Jr. or by playing a hand in whatever Nigel might expect from Professor McIntyre, would only result in my getting hurt, or worse. Weary from consternation as well as the day's events, which included a 6-hour bout with air sickness, I climbed the stairs to my 3rd-story office and was surprised to find the door unlocked. A light shone through the frosted glass that identified the tenant as Joe January, private investigator. Inside, Lindy was finishing the Chinese she'd ordered from around the corner. "Lindy," I said. When I didn't go on, she said, "You said yesterday you hoped to be back in New York today. I should have called you when we landed at Teterboro." "When I didn't hear from you," she said, "I figured either you were okay and you thought it unnecessary to call, or something had come up and I should make myself available." The formality of this discussion was beginning to annoy me. I'd been gone for only a day and a half, but somehow it seemed much longer, and Lindy, despite the accusatory tone in her voice, was a sight for sore eyes. What I said was, "It's good to be home." I hung my hat from the coat tree by the door and took a step, takeout in hand, toward the couch. "Joe," she said tentatively, her voice suddenly warmer, and I stopped. When I didn't come to her rescue, she went on, "You look tired. You probably don't want to drive home. That couch can't be comfortable. Why don't you stay at my place? I'll drive and you can eat on the way." On the ride to Lindy's place, I filled her in on the highlights of the day, primarily of our flight from the hotel to the track, leaving out the details. I was convinced she wouldn't have believed me anyway. When she asked about Melissa's brother, I told her that he had been a victim of mistaken identity, but didn't add that I thought it likely he was dead. I explained that I had hoped the case was closed but thought it unlikely, and that I expected yet to hear from the McIntyres, probably in the next day or two. That was the clinical part of our reunion. Later, I undressed her slowly, gently touching her in those places I knew would bring, for both Lindy and me, the desired response. I made love to her then, slowly, gently, but more passionately than I ever had before. Being an emotional coward, it was perhaps the best I could do in terms of an apology. Maybe it's because of the many years since that long ago night that today I surmise some part of me at some level knew I was about to lose Lindy. Lindy, I said afterward, needing to come clean, about the other night. Ginger. Shh, she said, and covered my mouth with her hand. I wanted to be angry at Lindy for not allowing me to make this confession. Perhaps she feared it was a preface to my breaking it off with her, yet angry at myself for taking so long to admit to myself what she'd come to mean to me, and angry at her again for being so forgiving of my transgressions against her. I heard, and not for the first time, Melissa's accusation. She sees in you what I see. But Lindy was laughing softly in that melodious way that was hers and hers alone. Resting on my elbow, I watched with fascination as her bare breasts, their nipples still erect, shook with laughter. What? I asked, surprised that the mention of Ginger had elicited laughter instead of tears or anger. I didn't tell you this, she said, her preface arresting my attention. She was looking up at me in that way that was hers alone. Where my eyes once rested, I now placed a hand. Lindy sighed softly and closed her eyes. Her tongue, moist and rough, darted out to wet her lips, and I thought she would forego the story she had not quite begun. But I was mistaken. The evening was yet young and the night long. She took a breath and continued, even as I felt her nipples stiffen between my thumb and forefinger. When I was talking to Ginger about Lance, she asked me how many medals he had. Her eyes fluttered open and she laughed again, but not before I noted her quickened heartbeat. It was the first time I could recall Ginger ever asking about someone else's jewelry. Lance would be offended, I said. In the service, they refer to medals as decorations. I know that, Joe, but a woman's jewelry amounts to pretty much the same thing, doesn't it? Decoration? I laughed, and a moment later, Lindy joined me. I rolled onto my back, and after our laughter subsided, Lindy covered my mouth again, but this time she covered it with her mouth. I spent that night with Lindy, a rarity for me, as I preferred instead the distance that spending the night alone provides. I'm glad now that I stayed, no matter that my initial reason was one of convenience. In the morning, after our shared shower, we made love to the sound of softly falling rain outside the bedroom window. In the afterglow, neither of us told the other that we loved them. I doubt that Lindy couldn't have known how I felt about her, perhaps in knowing she didn't need my reassurance. Still, I regret not telling her, if not for her sake, then for my own, to hear myself say the words, especially now, after discovering these many years later that she carried my child. Lindy later drove me to the office to pick up my car. Still got a half a minute? A couple minutes? Yes, Lindy, I said into the handset. I watched the light flashing on the phone indicating that someone was holding. I'd been so lost in thought, recalling last night and this morning's revelry, that I hadn't even heard the phone ring. Professor McIntyre, Lindy said. I felt my heart sink as I glanced at my wrist and cursed myself for having left my watch at Lindy's place. Yet it didn't matter what the time. Already my worst fears were coming to call. I sighed. All right, thanks, Lindy. I punched the flashing button on the phone and spoke into the handset. What can I do for you, Professor? I wondered if he could hear the reticence in my voice. Mr. January, I'm sorry to bother you. I had little hope I'd find you there on a Sunday. My lucky day, I thought. I know I've already put you through a ringer, and you have every right to say no, and I expect you will, but what is it? I'd like you to accompany Melissa to her office at Columbia to pick up a certain package. You know to what I'm referring. Obviously, I can't go. It wouldn't be prudent for me to be seen on campus just yet. I'd feel better if my daughter had an escort. You've spoken to your friend in London? Not yet. I said nothing as I considered options. I still had the unused portion of my retainer, which I was planning to return anyway. a 40-minute trip to Columbia and back, and I could tack on another day. All right, I said, I'll be there in 20 minutes. I never did say goodbye to Lindy, which today, a century later and then some, is both torment and comfort to me. Instead, I told her it was Sunday and that she wasn't obligated to stay any later than she wished. Grabbing my hat and trench coat, I explained I had a short errand to run for the McIntyres for which I could charge another day. After a moment, I asked her what time it was. I then told her I hoped to be back to the office by noon and that if she were still here, I'd take her to lunch and follow her back to my place to get my watch, which I imagined I'd forgotten intentionally. I'll always remember how she looked that long ago morning, her complexion still flushed from our morning lovemaking as she smiled and said, "I'll be here when you get back then." 35 years would pass before we saw each other again.